Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
For as long as I can remember, I've always felt like an outsider in my own family, as if I was the guest who overstayed their welcome rather than someone who actually belonged. It wasn't one big, dramatic event that made me feel this way, not some explosive moment of rejection that could be pointed to as the defining instance of my alienation, but rather a thousand small, subtle things that built up over time until the truth became undeniable. It was the way my father always spoke about my brother with pride, but could barely muster up anything more than indifference when talking about me. It was the way family events always seemed to be planned without my input, invitations casually forgotten, details never passed along, like an unspoken understanding that my presence wasn't really necessary. It was the way I would walk into a room and feel like I was intruding, like I was interrupting something that had already been decided before I even arrived. For years, I ignored it, told myself I was imagining things, convinced myself that I was being too sensitive, that family didn't have to make you feel included all the time, that maybe I was just expecting too much. I made excuses for the holidays I spent alone, for the birthdays they barely acknowledged, for the times I reached out only to be met with vague, dismissive responses. I convinced myself that as long as I kept trying, as long as I kept making the effort, things would eventually change, that one day they would see me the way I had always wanted to be seen, like I mattered. Thanksgiving was always the worst. Every single year, I waited for an invitation that never came, for a text message or a phone call telling me when to show up, for a simple acknowledgement that I was part of the tradition. Every year, I held onto the hope that maybe this time would be different, that maybe they had finally remembered, that maybe this time they actually wanted me there. And every year, I was disappointed. Some years, I would find out after the fact, scrolling through social media only to see pictures of smiling faces gathered around the table, the warmth of family captured in images that I was never part of. Other years, I would hear about it in passing, as if it were an afterthought, a casual mention of a meal I was never invited to but was still expected to react to with enthusiasm. This year, I finally decided to ask. I don't know what made me do it, what finally pushed me to stop pretending that I didn't notice, what made me reach out to my father instead of waiting for an invitation that would never come. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was anger, maybe it was just the simple, desperate need to hear it from his own mouth rather than being left to wonder. I sent him a message, short and to the point, trying to make it sound casual even though my stomach was twisting itself into knots as I typed the words. Hey, what time is Thanksgiving dinner this year? I watched the message sit there, unread, for hours, my anxiety growing with every passing minute, my heart pounding every time my phone buzzed only to find it was a notification from someone else. And then, finally, late in the evening, when I had almost convinced myself he wasn't going to answer at all, my phone lit up with a response. There's no room at the table this year. That was it. No apology, no explanation, no attempt to soften the blow. Just a single, emotionless sentence that made it clear I was not welcome, that I had never been welcome, that all these years of hoping and waiting had been for nothing. I stared at the words, my breath catching in my throat, my mind scrambling for a way to make sense of it, for some justification that would make this hurt less. Maybe it was an issue of space. Maybe they had invited too many people. Maybe there really wasn't enough room. I wanted so badly to believe that it wasn't personal, that it wasn't a deliberate choice, that there was some logical reason for my exclusion that had nothing to do with how they really felt about me. And then, later that night, my phone buzzed again. I glanced down at the screen, expecting another generic notification, another distraction from the ache that was settling deep into my chest, but instead, I saw my aunt's name. I opened the message, and my breath caught as I stared at the image she had sent, a picture of the entire family gathered around the Thanksgiving table, plates full, glasses raised in a toast, wide smiles on every face. And right there, in the very center of it all, sitting directly next to my father, was an empty chair. I felt my stomach drop, a sharp, gut-wrenching kind of pain cutting through me as I realized exactly what this meant. This wasn't a matter of space. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't just a logistical issue that had forced them to make difficult decisions. This was intentional. This was deliberate. This was a choice. There was room at the table. They just didn't want me there. I sat there for what felt like forever, staring at the picture, my fingers tightening around my phone, my heartbeat hammering in my ears as something inside me finally snapped. I wasn't just forgotten. I wasn't just overlooked. I wasn't just the afterthought I had convinced myself I was. I was excluded on purpose. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let it go. I stared at that picture for what felt like an eternity, my hands gripping my phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my chest rising and falling in uneven, ragged breaths as I tried to process what I was looking at. My mind kept trying to make excuses, trying to find some reason, some explanation that didn't hurt as much as the truth, but no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, no matter how many different angles I attempted to view it from, there was no escaping the obvious reality staring me in the face. The chair was empty, completely unoccupied, positioned right beside my father as if it had been waiting for someone to fill it, as if there had been plenty of room all along. For years, I had let myself believe that my exclusion from family events was just an accident, an unfortunate oversight, an unintentional mistake that I shouldn't take personally. I had told myself that maybe they had forgotten to invite me, that maybe plans had changed at the last minute, that maybe it wasn't as deep as I was making it out to be. I had convinced myself that the growing distance between us wasn't something they were doing on purpose, that it was just life getting in the way, that it wasn't something I should hold against them. But now, looking at that picture, seeing that chair sitting there untouched, knowing that my father had told me there was no room while an empty seat remained at his side, I felt something inside of me break. Shock turned into devastation, a heavy, suffocating kind of grief that settled deep in my stomach, making it impossible to breathe, impossible to think, impossible to do anything but sit there and let it wash over me in waves. My own father had chosen to exclude me, not because of space, not because of logistics, not because of any reasonable excuse, but simply because he didn't want me there. The realization hit me like a freight train, knocking the air from my lungs, leaving me reeling from the sheer force of it. This wasn't just about Thanksgiving. This was about every holiday, every birthday, every moment of my life when I had been pushed aside, treated like an afterthought, made to feel like I didn't belong. I let my mind drift back through the years, replaying all the times I had sat alone on Christmas morning while the rest of my family gathered without me, all the birthdays where my father had forgotten to call, all the times I had reached out only to be met with short, dismissive responses that made it clear I wasn't a priority. I thought about the way my father had always made me feel small, like I was just there, never truly part of anything, never truly important enough to include. I thought about the countless times I had swallowed my hurt, convinced myself that if I just kept showing up, if I just kept proving my worth, if I just kept trying, then maybe one day they would see me, acknowledge me, love me the way I had always wanted to be loved. But they never had. And now, looking at that picture, I knew they never would. The pain was sharp, cutting through me like a blade, raw and unforgiving, but underneath it, something else was stirring, something dark and electric, something that burned hotter than any sadness I had ever felt. It started as a slow, simmering heat in the pit of my stomach, a steady pulse of anger that grew stronger with every passing second, pushing away the grief, replacing the heartbreak with something stronger. I wasn't sad anymore. I was furious. I had spent my entire life chasing after scraps of love, begging for the bare minimum, clinging to the hope that one day they would see me as worthy as enough. I had bent over backward to be included, to be accepted, to be part of something that had never truly wanted me in the first place. And for what? For this? For a family that didn't care, for a father who lied to my face, for people who could look at me and still choose to push me aside? No more. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to beg for a seat at their table. I wasn't going to plead for their attention, wasn't going to waste another second of my time trying to fit into a space that was never meant for me. If they didn't want me there, then fine. I wasn't going to force my way in. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to break down and ask why, because the answer was already clear. Instead, I was going to do something else. I was going to make a reservation of my own. And as the thought settled into place, as the idea began to take shape in my mind, I felt something completely unexpected happen. I smiled. I didn't waste time second-guessing myself or wondering if I was being petty, because for the first time in my life, I was making a decision that wasn't about earning someone's approval or trying to fit into a space that had never truly belonged to me. I was done waiting, done hoping, done standing on the outside looking in while my father and the rest of them decided who was and wasn't worthy of a place at the table. If they didn't want me at their Thanksgiving, if they had made the deliberate choice to exclude me while keeping an empty chair in the spot where I should have been, then I would make sure that this year, they noticed my absence. I pulled out my laptop, my fingers moving swiftly across the keys as I searched for the perfect venue, scrolling past the usual chain restaurants, past the generic places with buffet-style dinners and dim lighting, past anything that felt too casual or too familiar. No, I wanted something better, something that would make a statement, something that would be impossible to ignore if word got out, which, of course, it would. After nearly an hour of searching, I found it, a high-end restaurant in the city, the kind of place that required reservations weeks in advance, the kind of place where people dressed for dinner, where the food wasn't just a meal but an experience, where every detail was curated to perfection. It was expensive, sure, but for once, I wasn't thinking about the cost. I was thinking about how it would feel to sit at a table filled with people who actually wanted me there, surrounded by warmth and conversation instead of awkward silences and half-hearted acknowledgments. Once the reservation was secured, I started working on the guest list, carefully selecting the names of people who would understand exactly why this dinner mattered. I wasn't just inviting a random assortment of acquaintances or filling seats with people out of obligation. I was curating a gathering of people who had been overlooked, dismissed, or treated like outsiders, people who had, at one point or another, been made to feel less than by the very same family that had shut me out. My extended relatives, the ones my father never bothered to invite to Thanksgiving because they weren't part of his carefully controlled circle, were the first on the list. A few distant cousins who had been pushed to the sidelines over the years, forced to hear about family gatherings after they had already happened, received their invitations next. And then, just for good measure, I extended an invite to a few people who I knew would truly shake the table, old family friends who had always been just close enough to know what went on behind the scenes, but never involved enough to call it out directly. The moment the invitations were sent, I knew it was only a matter of time before word spread. My family thrived on gossip, on whispered conversations exchanged in hushed tones over coffee, on the endless game of who knows what before anyone else does. I didn't have to reach out to my father directly, didn't have to make a scene or announce what I was doing. I simply let the information travel, knowing that it would find its way to him exactly when it was supposed to. And sure enough, it did. Less than 48 hours after finalizing the plans, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from my father, his name flashing across the screen like a warning, a sign that he had finally caught wind of what was happening. I let it ring a few times, just long enough to make him wonder if I would answer, just long enough to remind him that he was the one who had to reach out this time, just long enough to make him sit in the discomfort of waiting. Finally, I picked up. "Lauren," he said, his voice tight, controlled, like he was trying to mask whatever emotion was lingering just beneath the surface. "I heard you're hosting a gathering?" He said the last word like it was something foreign, something unfamiliar, something he couldn't quite wrap his head around. I leaned back against my chair, keeping my voice light, almost amused, as if I wasn't already anticipating exactly where this conversation was going. "That's right," I said, letting the words hang in the air, waiting for him to fill the silence. There was a pause, a hesitation so slight that if I hadn't known him as well as I did, I might have missed it. "I just don't understand why you're doing this," he finally said, and I could hear the carefully constructed concern in his tone, the feigned confusion, the subtle attempt to frame me as the one making things difficult. "It feels a little unnecessary, don't you think?" I smiled, even though he couldn't see it, even though he had no idea just how much I was enjoying this moment, just how satisfying it was to hear the discomfort creeping into his voice. "Oh, I don't know," I said, dragging out the words just enough to make my meaning clear. I just figured, there's always room at my table. I didn't give him time to respond, didn't give him the satisfaction of trying to spin the conversation in his favor, didn't give him the chance to turn this into another moment where I was left questioning myself. Instead, I simply ended the call, letting the silence do the rest of the work for me. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't wondering if he would call me back. I knew he would. The air inside the restaurant was warm and inviting, the golden glow of candlelight flickering against the elegant table settings, the soft hum of conversation filling the space with an energy that felt rich, alive, and completely unlike the stifling silence I had grown used to in my father's house. Everything had been carefully planned down to the smallest detail, from the deep red floral arrangements to the perfectly printed place cards, each one handwritten with the name of someone who had, at some point, been overlooked, dismissed, or made to feel like they weren't truly part of the family. This dinner wasn't just a gathering, it was a statement, a carefully orchestrated act of defiance, a way of reclaiming something that had been taken from me so many times before. As people arrived, their reactions were exactly what I had anticipated: surprise, curiosity, and, beneath it all, a flicker of something deeper, something unspoken, a quiet acknowledgement that this dinner, my dinner, meant more than just good food and polite conversation. The first whispers started almost immediately, exchanged in hushed voices as extended relatives took their seats, their eyes darting around the room as if trying to make sense of what they were seeing. It didn't take long before someone finally voiced the question I knew had been lingering in their minds from the moment they walked through the doors. "So, why exactly aren't you at your father's dinner tonight?" I turned toward the speaker, a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who had always been on the periphery of family events, present but never quite involved, always existing just outside the inner circle. I could see the genuine curiosity in her expression, the slight furrow of her brow as she tried to piece together the gaps in the story, tried to understand why I had gathered them here instead of being with the rest of my family. I could have answered her directly, could have explained everything in plain, simple words, but where would the satisfaction be in that? I simply smiled, letting the moment stretch out, letting the weight of the question settle over the room before reaching into my purse and pulling out the carefully folded piece of paper I had been waiting to reveal all night. With slow, deliberate movements, I unfolded it, smoothing out the creases before holding it up for everyone to see. The reaction was immediate. A collective gasp rippled through the table, forks clinking against plates as hands froze mid-motion, eyes widening in disbelief as they took in the image now displayed before them. It was the picture my aunt had sent, the one of my father's Thanksgiving dinner, the one with all of them gathered around the table, smiling, laughing, enjoying their meal, and the empty chair sitting right beside him, glaringly unoccupied, painfully obvious. A silent reminder of exactly what I had been excluded from. The whispers turned into murmurs, heads tilting as realization dawned, as the weight of the moment settled onto their shoulders, as they began to understand. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a simple case of forgotten invitations or miscommunication. This was intentional. This was deliberate. This was a choice. "I guess," I said finally, my voice light, almost amused, though there was an unmistakable edge beneath it, sharp and cutting like the very thing that had been used against me for so many years. "This chair was never meant for me." Silence. Thick, heavy, suffocating silence. And then, just as the weight of my words settled over the room, just as the realization of what had been done to me became undeniable, just as the truth fully sank in, he walked in. My father, standing in the doorway, realizing exactly what I had done. For a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with something heavy, something unspoken, something that crackled between us like electricity just before a storm. My father stood frozen in the doorway, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable, though I could see the flicker of unease in his eyes as he took in the sight before him, the long, beautifully set table filled with people who had once been nothing more than afterthoughts in his world, the elegant candlelight flickering against the polished glassware, the warmth of real, genuine laughter spilling through the air, completely untouched by his presence. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to me being the one in control. I could feel the shift happening around me, the slow unraveling of years' worth of carefully constructed narratives, the quiet dismantling of every excuse he had ever made for why I didn't belong. Family members who had once blindly followed his lead were now looking at him with something different in their eyes, something questioning, something sharp-edged and aware. They had seen the picture, they had heard my words, they had finally been presented with the undeniable truth, and now, for the first time, they were starting to see. Wait, so you really didn't invite her? The voice came from the other end of the table, hesitant but firm, belonging to a distant cousin who had always seemed indifferent to family politics, but was now staring at my father like he was trying to make sense of a puzzle that had never quite fit. My father hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as if he was grasping for the right words, the right excuse, the right way to spin this in his favor. But there was nothing he could say now, nothing he could do to undo what had already been exposed. No way to smooth over the fact that he had lied to me, dismissed me, excluded me on purpose. He wasn't just caught, he was cornered. One by one, the questions started coming, voices overlapping, disbelief turning into something sharper, something closer to anger. You told her there was no room, but there was an empty chair? This wasn't the first time, was it? How long has this been going on? And then, the worst one of all, the question that finally made his mask slip, the one that turned his face from barely concealed frustration to outright panic. Why though? Why her? The silence that followed was unbearable, stretching out into something ugly, something raw, something that made the weight of his exclusion impossible to ignore. For years, he had gotten away with it, had brushed me aside so effortlessly, so casually, that no one had ever really stopped to question it. But now, with all eyes on him, with the truth laid bare in a way that couldn't be dismissed, he had nowhere left to run. I watched as his shoulders tensed, his hands clenching at his sides, his jaw tightening like he was grinding his teeth together to keep from lashing out. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of judgment, wasn't used to being questioned, wasn't used to the weight of scrutiny pressing down on him instead of me. And for the first time in my life, I watched my father squirm. I could have let him struggle, could have sat back and enjoyed watching him fumble for explanations that no one would believe, could have made him stew in the discomfort of finally being the one on the outside looking in. But instead, I picked up my glass, letting the soft clink of my fingernails against the crystal stem draw the room's attention back to me. New traditions, I said, lifting my glass in a slow, deliberate motion, my voice carrying through the space with ease, steady and unwavering. To the people who actually want to be here. A pause. And then, one by one, glasses lifted around me, a chorus of agreement rippling through the room as everyone followed my lead, toasting to something new, to something real, to something better. And in that moment, as my father stood there, watching his control slip through his fingers, watching the people he had once so effortlessly commanded turn away from him, I knew it was over. He had lost. He said nothing as he turned on his heel, his back rigid, his movements stiff as he walked toward the door, his silence louder than any argument, any excuse, any pathetic attempt to justify what he had done. And as he disappeared from sight, I finally let out a slow, deep breath, feeling something I had never truly felt before. Free. As the night stretched on and the warmth of conversation wrapped around me like a long-forgotten embrace, I let myself settle into the realization that this was what family was supposed to feel like. No tension, no strained small talk, no walking on eggshells trying to mold myself into someone more acceptable, just the easy, effortless feeling of belonging, of being in a room filled with people who genuinely wanted me there. For years, I had chased after something that had always been out of reach, desperate for the kind of approval that was never actually mine to have, wasting time trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided that I wasn't enough. And for what? A seat at a table where I was only ever tolerated, where my presence was more of an obligation than a choice, where every glance in my direction felt more like an assessment than a welcome. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the rich taste settle on my tongue, the candlelight flickering against the deep red liquid in my glass, the soft hum of laughter and conversation filling the air around me. I looked at the faces surrounding me, at the people who had shown up, at the warmth in their eyes, at the ease with which we sat together, and I felt something click into place inside me, something that had been waiting to be acknowledged for far too long. I had spent years thinking that I needed them, my father, my so-called family, the people who had always treated me like an afterthought, but the truth was, I had never really needed them at all. What I had needed was this. Not their table. Mine. I thought back to the way my father had looked at me before he walked out, the way his shoulders had stiffened, the way he had realized, too late, that I had slipped through his fingers, that the control he had always wielded so effortlessly over me had crumbled into nothing. He had spent years deciding where I fit, dictating the space I was allowed to take up, making sure I always felt like I was just on the outside of something bigger than me, something I could never fully access. But now, he was the one standing outside looking in, the one who had been forced to face the reality of his own actions, the one who had been left behind while I moved forward. And the best part? I hadn't even needed to raise my voice. I hadn't needed to beg for an explanation. I hadn't needed to fight to prove my worth. I had simply walked away, built something better, and left him to sit in the wreckage of what he had done. The best revenge, I realized, wasn't anger, wasn't screaming, wasn't demanding answers from someone who had already made their feelings perfectly clear. It was simply choosing happiness without them. It was refusing to let them define me, refusing to let them dictate my worth, refusing to spend another second of my life waiting for love from people who were incapable of giving it. I had wasted years trying to earn a place at their table, trying to mold myself into something more palatable, more acceptable, more worthy in their eyes, and in the end, all it had taken to finally feel whole was walking away and building my own. I glanced around the room one last time, taking in the sound of laughter, the clinking of glasses, the easy way everyone leaned into each other, the absence of forced smiles and stiff postures. This was what it felt like to be wanted. Not tolerated, not accepted out of obligation, but chosen. And as I raised my glass for one final toast, letting my gaze sweep across the table, letting the warmth of the moment sink into my bones, I finally spoke the words I had been holding onto all night. The ones that had been sitting heavy on my chest, but now felt light, effortless, true. Family isn't about blood, I said, my voice steady, certain, filled with the kind of conviction I had never allowed myself before. It's about who saves you a seat at the table.